In the opening months of 2022, the PC gaming community was crying out for help. Prices on GPUs had skyrocketed out of control and availability had fallen through the floor. Nvidia was fully committing to its role as the bad guy at the time, and Intel were dragging their feet bringing Alchemist to market, so the people looked to AMD to do what they do best. Give us a $200 entry-level card that would last us through the dark times. Unto these desperate masses, the Red Team delivered relief from the scalper pandemic in the form of the Radeon RX 6500 XT. Thanks, AMD. I hate it. To relitigate the case against the Radeon RX 6500 XT one more time, in the first months of 2022, the scalper pandemic situation was pretty fraught. While AMD had been able to offer some compelling GPUs in the past for $200 or less, the combined market forces of decreased supply and increased demand meant that those cards exploded in price, and $200 could barely get you a second-hand R9 290. The previous generation RX 5500 XT had been seen as somewhat stagnant, offering a relatively small uplift over the RX 480, 580 and 590, and in fact, early bugs and the lack of any answer to Nvidia's RTX features meant it received a fairly negative reception back in late 2019. The 6500 XT came along at a time where gamers were clamouring for something like the 5500 XT but better, and in a way that's what we got. And then again, it really wasn't. Despite having the same naming structure, the 6500 XT had fewer shaders than its predecessor. The reduced PCIe bandwidth, lack of video encoders, and comparatively small number of display outputs led many to believe that this GPU was in fact a repurposed laptop chip. It had less VRAM than the RDNA 1 model, with an 8GB version being left to board partners to produce, and which ended up being as expensive as the far superior RX 6600 anyway. The new RDNA 2 architecture did mean improved performance per watt, but the net performance gain was virtually zero, and the new ray tracing functionality was barely worth talking about. Considering the cut corners and lack of consumer goodwill towards GPU manufacturers at the time, it would have been a nice gesture of AMD to launch the new card with a price cut, an olive branch to let gamers know they still cared about them. Instead, the RX 6500 XT came with a $30 price hike over the 4GB version of its predecessor. Incidentally, the company's market cap had risen about 60% over the previous year. Just thought I'd mention that. The Sapphire RX 6500 XT Pure is a dainty little thing, one that wouldn't look out of place in a small form factor build. I'm a Sapphire fan, and while this is pretty far from a Nitro, it's still not unappealing to me. I picked it up for under £100 from Amazon, which is about 40% cheaper than the next cheapest model. They usually seem to cost about the same as the 6GB RTX 3050, which, say what you like about that one, it has 2GB more memory and you can get bus-powered versions of it. Misleading model numbers aside, I have no qualms with the 3050 6GB. Either way, £100 is too much, as you'll soon see. You could get a second-hand GTX 1070 for less and a 2060 Super for 20 to 30 quid more. There's no way I'll make that money back on AdSense either, so if you enjoy my content, why not consider supporting the channel with a membership or with the Super Thanks button. I'll be testing this pretty little waste of silicon in a bunch of 2024 and 2025 titles using the MPG PC, featuring a Ryzen 5 7500F on a B650 motherboard, which has Gen 4 PCI Express, which you need to actually get the performance you paid for. Starting with Assassin's Creed Shadows, and there's a pattern that will soon emerge. At 1080p ultra low with performance FSR, I'm still seeing indicators that there's not going to be enough VRAM. Running through the built-in benchmark, the average hits 50, nearly 51 FPS with lows of 42. I went out for a bit of a roam around the open world to see if there were any obvious problems with crashes or missing assets, and I didn't notice anything. On the positive side, actual gameplay seems a bit smoother than the benchmark, hanging around 60 FPS far more often. Here's where we're going to have some trouble. Doom the Dark Ages struggles on 6GB cards, and straight away the game crashed when I tried to start at even the lowest settings. Take 2, and I did actually get to run my benchmark this time around, but I know this game's deliberately slower paced than the previous ones, but this is kinda ridiculous. At 20 FPS, the game is running in slow motion and looks like trash. I think I'd rather be playing one of the previous games, any of which would be playing just fine here. Here's some redemption for the 6500 XT. In Kingdom Come 2, it can achieve about 40 FPS at 1080 medium and only needs FSR quality to hit 60. Wait. No, these are the numbers from the 8GB RX 580 a couple of weeks ago. This 2-generation newer card hits 42 FPS at 1080p low. The Last of Us Part 2 doesn't have anything so gauche and uncouth as a VRAM indicator, which is presumably in response to all the panic the previous game caused, but it still needs a lot of the stuff to actually function. Case in point, at 1080p very low, the 6500 XT sees a pretty solid 30+ experience. Not bad, you might think. Except, once again, the RX 580 got virtually the same result at medium. The only reason Spider-Man 2 gets a better result than the old Polaris card is probably because I couldn't even get it to start on the 580. Still, the 30 FPS average requires the very low preset, and adding performance FSR doesn't even get us to 60. There are two things I don't like recommending. One is heavy FSR upscaling at 1080p, and the other is running Black Myth Wukong at the low quality preset. Unfortunately, with the 6500 XT, you don't have much choice, as the low preset at native 1080p only delivers around 20 FPS. I added 50% upscaling to 1080p medium, which at least passed the 30 mark and didn't give me a headache, but I don't think this is a good experience. Sorry to keep bringing up the RX 580, especially as it's a card I expressly said I wasn't going to review ever again, but it has to be done here. On the 6500 XT, Horizon Forbidden West runs at 24 FPS at 1080p very low, and looks like ass. Increasing to medium drops frames to 19 FPS, but at least it looks a bit better. So, all we have to do is add some FSR to bring the frame rate up and... nope. Nothing happens. The upscaling is definitely applying. I restarted the game, even rebooted the system, and the quality is definitely getting worse, but the frame rate just isn't budging. Why did I mention the RX 580? Well, it not only had no such problems with FSR, it could hit 36 FPS at medium without it. Again, the 6500 XT wins by default in Indiana Jones because the old Polaris card can't trace rays, but aside from that, the RDNA 2 card is just one giant L. Even with everything dropped to its minimum, the menu warns that there isn't enough memory, and at native 1080p it's only managing 17 FPS. Performance FSR does at least increase performance this time, and the quality doesn't look all that bad either. I ran through the whole jungle section to make sure it didn't crash, but I wouldn't be surprised if this 4GB card had some stability problems in the long run. One more UE5 game, and unfortunately one that doesn't support FSR3 as of yet. The built-in TAA Ultra upscaling in Clair Obscur, which is about on par with FSR performance, looks pretty terrible, and it can only bring the 1080p low results up from 19 FPS to 28. I don't think this one's playable, folks. Finally, rounding things out with a success story, GTA 5 Enhanced Edition can reach a whopping 125 FPS, with lows of around 100 at 1080p minimum. Why Iceberg, you say? Surely with that amount of overhead, you could increase the quality settings to improve the visuals a bit. To which I would say, no, it won't let me because I don't have enough VRAM. For a moment, it wouldn't even let me disable VSync. I had to swap TAA for FXAA, turn VSync off, and then switch back to TAA. This card's only 3 years old, it sold for $200. Why is it so shit? The RX 6500 XT didn't need to exist. It's not unheard of for AMD to skip a tier if they don't think they can compete that generation, and if it was that hard to offer an entry-level gaming GPU in 2022, then they could have just not bothered, saved that silicon for an 8GB model, sold it directly to the Ethereum miners, and increased their market cap by 61% instead of 60%. They chose instead to make the RX 6500 XT for the gamers, using what silicon they had that could be sold at a reasonable price, and paired it with 4GB of VRAM to make it less attractive to those pesky crypto bros. Yes, it was more expensive than the 5500 XT had been, but it was the best we could have asked for at the time. You couldn't judge the 6500 XT by the standards of 2019. Too much bad stuff had happened since then. Well, that's what some people were saying at the time. In 2025, we might not be out of the woods, but we have learned to live with this new normal, and hopefully people are becoming less inclined to believe that any of the massive corporations who make our gaming hardware have our best interests in mind. The 6500 XT was always an inferior product, and in a gaming landscape that sees 8GB frame buffers and hardware upscaling as mandatory, it has aged like a fine wine. You paid a lot for it, and now it's just so much piss. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.